What's going on, everybody? Joe Patrick here, back with another episode of Joe Patrick on football. If you don't know me, I am the Falcons insider for 92.9 The Game. I've been covering the Falcons since, what would it be? Since July of 2022, basically since training camp of 2022 started. That date is going to be a little bit relevant for some of the things we're going to talk about today on the show. Not a whole lot to talk about, actually. It is June 25th. After all, this is the dead of dead periods in the NFL where players are, taking their final, I don't want to say breaks, because the players around the league are definitely working out, getting their bodies ready, but obviously not on the field, not part of team activities here until training camp gets started up in just about a month. We're about a month away today, basically, from training camps getting going. So we have that to look forward to. But we're just going to go through a little bit of things that have come across the news the past few days. Jaire Alexander, we'll talk about him a little bit. There's been this interesting documents that have been published by Pablo Torre about a grievance from the NFL Players Association with regards to potential collusion that was not considered. They didn't get anywhere with this, from my understanding. But the Falcons were referenced, and Arthur Blank was testified in this and was in the documents kind of talking about that. So we'll kind of get into that and why I think it's a big nothing burger, but it is something. Then I also just want to respond to some of the criticisms of the viewpoints that I put out there about Terry Fontenot from the last show. If you didn't catch that, by the way, definitely go back and watch that one, because it definitely, I guess, I guess it is a hot take to say that Terry Fontenot has not been as bad as everyone thinks. But I'll clarify exactly what I meant, and I think I was clear at the time, but I'll reiterate that when we get to that point. But let's start with Jaire Alexander. This kind of came back up in the news because obviously we heard about him going to the Ravens, but Jeremy Fowler from ESPN was, I believe, on SportsCenter or one of their TV shows, and there was a little package with him talking about how the deal went down. And he mentions that the Falcons, he actually lists the Falcons as the first team that he references of teams that apparently Jaire Alexander turned down in order to sign with the Ravens. Yeah, I don't buy that at all, and that's not just a hunch by me. I have talked to some people about this, and it never really felt like something that was on the cards for the Falcons. In fact, Jalen Ramsey is another impact cornerback that's been out there on the market. We've talked about him on the show. To me, that is one where if the Falcons were looking to go out and make a splash and bring in a player that they really believed in and thought could make a difference on this defense, then that would be the player. It wouldn't be Jaire Alexander. I think one of the reasons why Alexander was considered a possibility for the Falcons is because he was basically free. He got cut, so he wasn't going to cost anything, as opposed to Jalen Ramsey. He is going to cost something because the team will have to trade for him, and it's the reason why I don't think that Jalen Ramsey will ultimately be an Atlanta Falcon. But Jaire Alexander, first of all, just as a player, he just does not kind of fit to me. I know there's a connection between, because you have Jerry Gray, the team's assistant head coach, or defense assistant head coach / defense, I think is the title for him. Obviously worked with Jaire Alexander during his time, but that's a very kind of weak link to me. And it just never felt like something that was going to come to fruition. I just want to say this, I think this is, and maybe I'm in kind of better position to understand the different aspects of it with regards to how the Falcons feel about the player and such. But, I think you do have to take these reports, whether it's from, and it's not to single out Jeremy Fowler, by the way, because I've seen him at Flower Branch during training camps. I've literally seen him talking to Terry Fontenot when we're out there. So I'm not trying to say that he doesn't talk to anyone or is a bad reporter or anything like that. But I think that sometimes reporters, especially when they're on TV, because I've been in this position myself, you're on TV or radio, you're talking, you're just saying things. And maybe it doesn't kind of come across in the most accurate fashion. And, I think that probably what happened here when he says that the Falcons were a team that Jaire Alexander turned down, I think he probably talked to Jaire Alexander's agent, and I wouldn't have been surprised if his agent was kind of, trying to play him up at the time and kind of make it look like there was this big market for Jaire Alexander. And I'm not saying that, maybe I'm sure the Falcons name wouldn't have kind of appeared here had there not been any contact whatsoever. I would certainly expect the Falcons to kick the tires on a Jaire Alexander or any player, but it probably didn't get any further than that. And I think that, but you know, that probably happened. And that's one of the reasons why the agent maybe said the name. And that's kind of what Fowler was going on. That's my read of the situation. But ultimately, I can tell you that there was never really any, like, the Falcons were not like intent to go out and get Jaire Alexander for this defense. So wanted to clear that up because that's been kind of a hot topic here as of late. Maybe one of the hotter topics has been this documents that Pablo Torre published. I believe, I can't remember. He's got his own enterprise going. Pablo Torre Finds Out, I believe, is where he released this. I believe it's a 61-page document that is essentially a grievance from the Players Association about potential collusion, which was not proven in the courts. I don't even think they took it up because the case was so weak. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of the details of it all because, frankly, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to like be out of line here with what I say about whatever. But to me, just kind of going through it is a big nothing burger. I saw there was one report, or there was a tweet that kind of went around from a reporter saying that the Falcons were not interested in not interested in Lamar Jackson at the time, and they played Desmond Ridder as their starting quarterback the next year, which makes the situation look way worse because of a potential injury and something else. I can't even remember what it was off the top of my head. I'm sorry. Ultimately, I don't think any of this matters. It doesn't matter because Lamar Jackson was never playing anywhere but Baltimore. And that's according to, in the report, it says even teams determined that Jackson didn't want to play anywhere, and the Ravens didn't want him to play anywhere else. And it all kind of stems from the Deshaun Watson deal, and that deal was fully guaranteed, and then that's what Lamar Jackson was going for, and that's where I think the grievance kind of falls, where he didn't get the guaranteed deal like Watson did. That's atypical. Usually kind of when a standard is set, things continue to go that way, whether it's the total amounts of money or, certain stipulations around how the money is paid. And clearly there was kind of a step back. I mean, it was a crazy deal that Cleveland did. In fact, Arthur Blank is quoted in his testimony there saying that, they paid like $80 million more than anybody else was willing to. And they just kind of and I'll paraphrase him there by saying, like, that's wild, basically. And listen, the situation with Lamar Jackson, it's not that the Falcons wouldn't have wanted Lamar Jackson to be their quarterback if they felt like they could make that happen. It's that they didn't feel like they were going to be able to make that happen. And if that's the case, you're only digging yourself into a hole from a PR perspective by going out there and kind of saying that you want to acquire this player for it ultimately not to happen, and the effects that can have on, your marketing, on your, how players on the roster potentially feel. It just would have created a whole mess. And that's why everybody around the league followed the same suit, and the Falcons were maybe the most prominent name because they had the biggest hole at quarterback, and they proceeded with the biggest unknown at quarterback, which, by the way, is probably the biggest mistake of Terry Fontenot's tenure, which we talked about on the last show. But ultimately, the situation was whatever a team came and offered Lamar Jackson, the Ravens were going to be able to match. And the whole point of tendering him to this non-exclusive franchise tag was to allow other teams around the NFL to basically set the market for him. That ultimately didn't even happen because every other team, I think, knew that that's what the whole point was. And so they weren't going to go out there and do that and kind of show their cards and say, this is how much we're going to pay in this situation. You just give up a lot of leverage at that point, and a lot of strategic leverage at that. So, and that's why it was thought to be, the players kind of said this was a collusion amongst the NFL clubs because none of them came out and kind of, made this negotiation. But that's also, I think, why it didn't really hold much water for the legal authorities that were kind of deciding on this case. So anyway, it's kind of unfortunate that crops back up in the news just because it's like old news. And I just think that it's honestly, it just feels like rage bait to me, especially for Falcons fans. Maybe Falcons fans more than any other fan base because of the situation they were in with the quarterback and ultimately how things ended up with that quarterback. And I got to, there was a reporter out there that covers the team that I think just totally like, and maybe even intentionally like misconstrues the situation and saying, and like almost to say that like the Falcons thought they were in better shape with Desmond Ridder than Lamar Jackson. And that's just not the case. It's a laughable notion, obviously. And listen, like the Falcons, they had a lot of money to splash around. Had they again, not even say they could have gotten Lamar Jackson because they were never going to get Lamar Jackson with this money. But even like that was the summer where they signed Jesse Bates, Caden Ellis, David Onyemata. We went through the names on the last show that have become like really important cornerstones for this team. So it was still like a successful free agency period for the Falcons, even though they weren't able to come away with a superstar quarterback, which they were never going to get in the first place. So anyway, that's out of the way. Let's get I just wanted to address some of the criticisms that I read from I was looking on Twitter after it was posted. I kind of made a tweet about it as well, promoting the show on Tuesday. And I engaged with some people because I think there are some good faith arguments to be made. But I think first of all, what I want to clear up is like the point was never that I think Terry Fontenot has been a great general manager for the Falcons. Even a good one, frankly. Like, I think that he's basically been average, all things considered. When you say, and I think he's been above average when you look at the free agency signings. He's clearly been below average when you look at the draft picks as we assessed. And I think the most interesting thing to dive into when you look at Terry Fontenot's track record with the Falcons is these big unconventional decisions that he's made, with the Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix signings, drafting Bijan in the top 10, drafting Kyle Pitts in the top 5. And again, these are for better or for worse, whether they've paid off or they have not. I respect the fact that he's willing to do something unconventional. And I think generally speaking, with those big decisions, those key ones, I think that he's probably gotten them more often than right. He's probably gotten them more right than wrong, I should say. And I say probably because Penix is kind of still undecided. We can't really make a firm determination on that yet. But I think that it makes sense to be able to say that things are looking good in that sense, that in his first 3 games of his career, not any 3-game stretch, but the first 3 games of him as a starter in the NFL, he has 11 big time throws. Or I think that's actually been revised down to 10. Still, that's a projection that would put him, prorate that over the course of a season. That would have had him number 1, like by far, over Josh Allen. Not to say that would have happened. Again, I'm just saying that 3-game stretch, and for it to be the first 3 games of his NFL career, I think speak to really promising signs for what he can be going forward as the Falcons quarterback. And that is fully backed up when you talk to Raheem Morris and you talk to Zach Robinson, you talk to TJ Yates, these personnel who have worked very closely with Michael Penix absolutely back up the stats that he's put out there on the field. And so I don't think you can just say it's purely a toss-up whether Michael Penix is going to be good or not. Do we know for sure? No, we don't. We don't know that. But I think that we have enough encouraging signs to say that that was a good decision. And I think that a lot of people that are listening to this podcast probably agree with that statement. But I think that, there are some people that would debate it. And so I wanted to clear that up. I think the other interesting point that was brought up to me and that I was responding to on Twitter, and I didn't respond to everybody. I kind of just had to tune it out at some point because it becomes such a distraction in your day. So I apologize if there are any of you guys who kind of were objecting to something that I said that you disagreed with and I wasn't taking you up on, is because eventually I just mute it and just kind of put it past me. But to draft Bijan, Bijan was selected 8th overall. Jalen Carter, the Georgia product, goes 9th overall, and Jalen Carter was by many ranked as the best prospect in that draft. It's notable, I think, to say that he was passed on by multiple teams, not just the Falcons, but obviously all the teams in front of the Falcons in that draft, which I think says something about the concerns that teams had with him, which was obviously not about who he was as a player, but obviously about the behavioral issues or the things that happened at Georgia. And it wasn't obviously stuff that kept him off the field, but some pretty ugly stuff with regards to the car wreck and everything. And then he had the pro day, I believe it was, where he couldn't even finish his drills. He was too out of shape, basically, which I think concerned some teams at the time. And so I say that to just say that there were some concerns that teams had with Jalen Carter. I would also say the Falcons, I think, would have been perfectly justified, obviously, taking Jalen Carter. And when we're comparing Bijan Robinson to Jalen Carter, they're both great players. And I don't think that it would be hypothetical to say that oh, well, Jalen Carter would not have been as good for the Falcons as he would for the Eagles. But I do not think it's so hypothetical to say that when you just looked at the rosters and the setup around Jalen Carter, when you place him on the Falcons versus when you place him on the Eagles, I think he's much better set up to succeed, not only in that first year, his rookie year with the Eagles, but to set him up for a better career when you're just talking about the mentors, the veterans he had on that defensive side of the football there in Philadelphia, especially up front with Brenton Cox, those types of guys. Much better, I think, kind of set up for him there than it would have been with the Falcons. The other thing with drafting Bijan over Jalen Carter is I do think that while they're both very talented players, and let's assume that Jalen Carter performs as well as he has for the Falcons as he has for the Eagles, I think Bijan Robinson is better suited because of the position that he plays and the talent that Bijan has. He was better positioned to basically change the Falcons' offensive identity, to really be a cornerstone in that kind of identity and the style of play and the things that he can make happen for a Falcons offense that didn't have a ton going for them at the time. Remember, they had Desmond Ridder at quarterback. And that was kind of, that's interesting to kind of be putting the pieces around the quarterback before you had that quarterback itself. But we're starting, I think, to see that happen more and more around the league. You're starting to see because those other pieces are more sure bets, and teams, I think, are kind of biding their time and waiting till the right quarterback comes along for them to plug in there to kind of complete the puzzle. Because it's worth noting during Terry Fontenot's regime, and especially when they've been looking for a quarterback basically since they lost Matt Ryan, there weren't really many quarterbacks available to them. There was obviously the Lamar Jackson thing, which we just talked about, but I would argue that he was never available for them. Again, Ridder was the second quarterback off the board in that draft class. The number one quarterback was Kenny Pickett. He has not even turned out to be anything. None of the other quarterbacks from that draft class have turned out to be anything except for Brock Purdy, who was the last pick in that draft. And so every team was passing on Brock Purdy in that draft. So it's a little bit of an unfortunate circumstance for Terry Fontenot to find himself in, particularly when searching for that solution at quarterback. And I think it's one of the reasons why they wanted to go full bore when they found the opportunity to go for the quarterback, where they had obviously the option in free agency with Kirk Cousins, in addition to a loaded quarterback draft class. That's the time where they felt like they had to unload basically everything they had to make sure they had that secured. And listen, the Kirk Cousins gambit didn't really work. It was always going to be a pretty thin needle to thread to make it work perfectly, where Kirk Cousins is great and then transitions into Michael Penix, who's ready to go and plays. But all things considered, for Michael Penix to have shown what he's shown so far, I think that has worked out relatively well. And one of the other arguments that someone was saying to me was that you have to do the positives outweigh the negatives, and they were saying they don't. And I would kind of say they do, or on the course of doing, because I think that if Michael Penix does hit in the way that I certainly expect him to, and I think a lot of people are seeing and expecting him to, then I think that does outweigh missing on the Kirk Cousins $100 million signing. It certainly doesn't, outweigh maybe for Arthur Blank's pocketbook, but I don't really care about Arthur Blank's pocketbook. I just care about the Falcons on the field, and that's basically 2 years where you're just kind of where that cash is you're feeling the pain from that loss to that bad contract for Kirk Cousins. Outside of that, you're getting many, many years of Michael Penix. And yes, you're not going to get the rookie quarterback contract where you can then go out and, spend a bunch of money on other players while you've got this cheap quarterback. But I think that it's that in and of itself is also like very kind of unicorn thinking. And I think that CJ Stroud is a perfect example of it, where like, yeah, he has a great rookie year. And then he comes back his sophomore season and is not so good. So like it's very rare. I think you come across the quarterback that is just a hit off the draft. He's the quarterback that you're going with. He's drafted to be your starter, and then that's the quarterback that you roll with. And he's just good the entire time. You have him on cheap money until you have to give him a new contract. And you have all those years in which to like spend all this money on other players. In fact, like usually what we're seeing, like with Jalen Hurts, is that they get the contract extension when the team knows that they're going to be good. They want to lock them down, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the team to really kind of be pushing the envelope basically on having this cheap quarterback into like his fourth year, even though he's performing at a very high level for you. So anyway, it's a little bit of a interesting topic, obviously. And I know that it's never like a popular take to give, that like a GM who has overseen a team that has not made the playoffs is like actually underrated. I would make one more point, which is that I think that like people don't really appreciate how difficult of a task this has been for Terry Fontenot, where he joins an organization that he kind of has to dismantle. Like that's basically the first thing he starts doing is they have to get rid of these players that are not going to be with with them in the next chapter of this organization. So you have to move on from Matt Ryan, Julio Jones. You have to figure out those pieces on defense. Can't remember the linebacker's name, but there's a high price linebacker there. Gosh, that name is slipped my mind. Point is, he had to dismantle a team and then build it back up. So that in and of itself is going to be like 3 years of you can't really make the playoffs. Like it's pretty much impossible. And in that third year, they still like could have made it and probably should have made it. And it was disappointing that they didn't make it because you'd already felt like you were actually overperforming during this quote unquote rebuild, winning 7 games, especially in that second year where like the Falcons, you ask a lot of people, it was like between 2 and 5 wins. If you said they were going to win 5 wins, people would kind of look at you sideways. They won 7 games that year, and they got lucky, I think, with some of the opponents and the injuries that they had. Like they beat the 49ers, for example, and the 49ers were missing like every single one of their defensive linemen, including Nick Bosa in that game. So there were some things that went their way, but ultimately, I think that it's been a tough job for Terry Fontenot in terms of what he's been tasked at doing. And obviously he's underperformed. They should have been in the playoffs by now. This team should have made the playoffs probably the last couple of years. And that's been a disappointment. But again, the reason why it's been a disappointment is because I think a lot of Falcons fans have felt like this team has been good enough and they've been in position late in the season to make the playoffs, and they just haven't gotten it done. So that's all I wanted to say. And it's not that I think that he's like, again, a great general manager or like that his tenure has been like so great to this point. In fact, I think his job is on the line this year, and same with Raheem Morris. But I think as it relates to Terry Fontenot, he has to back up the whatever it is, these interesting decisions, these big decisions. Ultimately, that has to culminate in success in terms of making the playoffs. Otherwise, what's the point? So we'll see if that happens this year. I tend to think that it will. And by the way, I don't know if it's going to be a year where the Falcons just have to win the division to get in. That's kind of been the narrative around the NFC South for the last several years because it's been a weak division. But, with the Saints, if they're going to be, one of the worst teams in the NFL, who knows what the Panthers are going to be, but they've been poor the last few years. If those are easy wins for the others in the division, that makes it easier for the Falcons and Bucks win totals to climb up. It's obviously a tough schedule for the Falcons, but the Falcons were in position last year to potentially have made the playoffs as a wild card if they won that game against the Commanders and then win that last game against the Panthers at home, which they didn't win either. But I wouldn't just rule that out that they have to win the division to make the playoffs. But I think that they very well could, and Maybe will. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see if they win the division. But anyway, thank you guys for joining us once again. We will be back again next Tuesday and Thursday. We'll be having shows every Tuesday and Thursday until we get to training camp. And then once we get into training camp, we'll basically be doing a show after every practice. And they might not be as long. We'll basically just be talking about what happened at practice, what the players and coaches were saying and stuff like that. But that will certainly be a lot more interesting than the stuff we're talking about here in late June and early July. Oh, one other thing is that the quarterbacks documentary, the quarterbacks documentary on Netflix. The Netflix documentary Quarterbacks comes out on July 8th. So we're under 2 weeks away from that. That should be pretty entertaining. And we'll certainly be talking about, what is shown. So I think we'll learn a lot about the Falcons quarterback situation and kind of, what all transpired during the Kirk Cousins signing and the whole saga. So it'll be fun to break that down with you guys. Tune in again next Tuesday and Thursday and follow us, Joe Patrick on football, anywhere you get your podcasts, 92.9 The Game on YouTube. Take care.